In this section, we learn how to deploy our DLT pipeline in Orchestra and schedule it. So let's get started. So before we start, it's a good practice to separate our GitHub source and pipeline definition. As you can see in this file in GitHub pipeline, we've defined our GitHub source configuration using REST API source, and we also defined the pipeline here in the same file. So it's a good practice to separate these two. So let's go ahead and comment the pipeline definition out. Let's save it. Now let's create a new file called initial script.py. Now let's import DLT and let's import the GitHub pipeline source configuration, which is named as GitHub_pipeline. Now let's create a main function and let's load the source from our GitHub pipeline file or module. So we can do that by defining a variable called source and GitHub_pipeline dot GitHub source. So basically what this syntax is doing is it goes to GitHub pipeline and extracts this GitHub source, which has our REST API source configuration. And then now we can define our pipeline here. We'll initialize pipeline. We'll do this by defining the variable pipeline, dlt.pipeline. We can give the pipeline name as Orchestra GitHub init and we can give the destination as BigQuery. We can give the data set name as Orchestra GitHub init, and we can use the parameter progress is equal to log, which gives us detailed information about like extraction, normalization, and loading phase. So once we've done that, we can run pipeline by defining a variable info pipeline.run, and we give the source which we just defined here. And then let's print the info as well, and then return info. Since we defined a main function, we need an entry point into this file. So we do that by using doc _name _ equal to _main, and then we call the main function. So let's save this file. Now let's check the status. You can see we have a modified file and we have a new untracked file called initial script.py. So now let's add this. Git add dot let me just clear the terminal. Now let's commit these files. Initial script. Now you can just type the command git push. Now you should see the initial script file in your GitHub repository. So let's refresh. Yeah, as you see, you can see your initial script file in your GitHub repository. All right, now let's create a pipeline in Orchestra. So let's go to Orchestra. You can already see that our integration status is connected. So let's go to pipelines and then create a new pipeline. Let's give this name as DLT init. And let's use the execute script since we've written our DLT pipelines in Python. We'll give this task name as init script. Our script source is GitHub, and our Python command would be Python initial script.py. So this is the same script which we just pushed to our GitHub code, initial underscore script.py. The package manager would be pip version 3.2. So if you click the optional parameters, here in the connection, you choose your integration. So when you click this drop down, you should see your integration which we just created. So select DLT integration. We won't be giving any values for this. We'll take a look at all these options later in the course. So build command is you type in pip install -r requirements.txt. So Orchestra pulls this code requirements.txt and installs all the libraries required for us to run the DLT pipeline in its own compute environment. We don't need to input anything in the environment variables as we are not passing in any arguments. And then rest everything else we can just leave it as it is. So now let's click next and let's save it. It's asking if you would like to set up an alert, but we'll skip it for now. We'll take a look at this in the monitoring section. And you can commit this, initial commit, and this is the pipeline versioning we spoke about earlier. So let's confirm, and then we need to publish this pipeline. All right, so let's run this pipeline now. Our task started running. So you can see that it's currently building the environment with all the necessary libraries. And it's executing our initial script right now. Let's see if we can view any logs. All right, you can see we can view the logs in real time. It's currently extracting from all our resources. We have 5 resources here. Yeah, it seems like our task has finished running. We can probably check some metadata details here. It took like almost 1 minute 27 seconds to run when it started and when it completed. So let's just validate that the data has loaded. Let's go to BigQuery. I'm gonna just refresh this. We should be able to see our data set, Orchestra. Yeah, as you can see here, we have our data set name Orchestra GitHub in it, and we can see all our resources tables loaded here, and we can just query one of them to make sure we have all our data. So let's as you can see, we have all our data loaded into BigQuery. All right, now let's schedule this pipeline to run every day at 10 a.m. So let's go to Orchestra. Now let's edit this pipeline. Here, as you can see, we've been manually triggering this pipeline. So let's add a cron trigger. Let's say, give it a name, trigger at 10 a.m. You can give the hours as 10. If you'd like to know more about cron values, you can go to Orchestra's official documentation, and there are many different examples on how to use cron expression to schedule your data pipelines. We can use the time zone, which is suitable for us, and let me check, and now let me save this, confirm, and let me publish this pipeline. Now your data pipeline is scheduled to run at 10 a.m. every day. We just learned how to schedule and deploy our DLT pipeline remotely using Orchestra. Our DLT pipeline loads data from these 5 resources into BigQuery. But what if we want to have resource level control? We can write pipeline definition for each of these resources, but that would not be scalable. Say for example, next week we have like 50 more resources. We cannot possibly write pipeline definition for each of these resources. So DLT provides a method called .withResources, which combined with Python, we can dynamically create pipelines for each of these resources and pass resource level parameters. So let's take a look at an example on how to implement this. Let's start by creating a new script called dynamic script. We'll import DLT. We'll import the GitHub pipeline module. Now let's create a function called define run resource with a parameter called resource name of type string. And then let's use this syntax which loads the base source from here and name this as base underscore source. Now we would use the DLT method .withResource to select specific resource from the GitHub pipeline source. Like say for example, we can select the resource releases or forks or issues very easily using this. So now let's define a variable called selected source where we use base source, and then use the method called .withResource, and we give the name the parameter which we just passed, resource name. And now let's create a pipeline. I'm going to just copy the pipeline definition from here because the rest of it's going to be almost pretty same. In order to create pipelines for each of these resources dynamically, we cannot use a hard-coded pipeline name. So we can use a Python string literal to create a pipeline name specific for each of these resources. So we can do that by naming orchestra underscore GitHub underscore dynamic underscore, in curly brackets we use the parameter resource name which we are passing to the function run resource. So this will create a pipeline name orchestra GitHub dynamic underscore the resource name. And we can also change the dataset name to orchestra GitHub dynamic. All right. Now let's define a variable info is equal to pipeline.run and use selected source. Now we run the pipeline specifically for this resource. Now let's print info. Return info. Now let's create the main function and define a variable called a, which will call the function run resource with the argument the resource name from our GitHub pipeline REST API source. So in this case, let's take repos and paste it here. Similarly, we'll define another variable and just copy this again. And this time we can use releases, another variable, probably issues. Then let's return all these. And just copy the entry point for the script. All right, now let's save this. Now let's add this file. Dynamic script. Now let's push. Yeah, now our GitHub pipeline should, GitHub repository should have this dynamic script. So we have the dynamic script file here. So let's go to Orchestra and let's create a new pipeline named DLT dynamic. Add a task group. You guys have already done this, so can be quick about it. DLT dynamic script, Python dynamic py. Connection, we use the DLT integration, build command, and I think we can leave the rest as it is. Right. Now let's save. Let's publish it. Now let's run this. All right, as we can see, we've successfully, the task executed successfully. So let's just cross confirm that all our data exists. So let's refresh our warehouse and go to Orchestra. GitHub dynamic was a data set. So let's just query one of these tables. All right, as you can see, we successfully loaded data from our pipeline, and we are able to dynamically create pipelines for each of our resources. And that's it for this section. In the next section, we'll take a look at what incremental loading is and implement it for one of our resources. I'll see you there.